Will a handshake seal a deal? President Xi Jinping and Donald Trump are set to meet at the G20 summit amid trade tensions between the world's two largest economies. Hello, I'm Mike Walter filling in for Anna Naidu, and this is The Heat. It is day two at the G20 summit in Osaka, Japan. Global leaders setting an ambitious agenda to tackle some of the world's most pressing issues. But it's the meeting on the sidelines making all the headlines, with much of the focus on a sit-down between Chinese President Xi Jinping and U.S. President Donald Trump. The first time the two are meeting since trade talks collapsed. So, can we expect a temporary freeze on additional tariffs? That's the question. To answer that question and more, let's go straight to our panel. Qinduo Xu joins us from Beijing. He's senior fellow at the Pangoal Institution. Joining us from London, Alexander Nekrassov was a former advisor at the Kremlin. Jim Moore joining us here on the set. He is CEO and founder of the Washington Institute for Business, Government, and Society. Moore also negotiated a number of trade deals on behalf of the United States with countries including Japan, China, and Brazil. And CGTN's White House correspondent Nathan King joining us from the side of the G20 summit. Well, welcome all of you to the show. Nathan, let's start with you. We're just a few hours away from this big sit-down. Everybody's talking about it. You hearing anything there?
Mike, I can tell you the White House is really tight-lipped at this hour at the moment. What I can tell you is that just a few hours ago, overnight here in Japan, Liu He, the chief negotiator, as we know, from China, met with his counterparts at the U.S. President's hotel, and we're talking about Steve Mnuchin, the U.S. Treasury Secretary, the U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer, for talks ahead of the big face-to-face meeting between the two presidents. Now, coming out of that meeting, everyone was very tight-lipped indeed. What we have been led to expect, and mainly this is coming from the US sources, is that there could be some sort of truce. Remember back at the G20, last G20 in Buenos Aires, the day after on December 1st, there was a truce called by the two leaders. But since then, of course, we have seen a massive ratcheting up of sanctions by the US after talks hit a wall back in May. And so we're now essentially looking at Chinese products tariffed to the tune of 25% on about 250 billion. We've had hearings about another 300 billion. The US president says he could still use those. We'll wait and see. The best that can be hoped for is perhaps a pause, like we saw in Buenos Aires, and maybe the resumption of talks as well. But remember, there are other issues that have come in since the last time these two leaders met. Huawei, of course, being put on the entities list, the telecommunications giant essentially cut off potentially from its US suppliers. It could hit the company to the tune of $30 billion, says the founder. And there are other issues as well outside of trade as well. So the feelings between Washington and Beijing have not improved since the talks hit a wall in May.
Now, Nathan, you're there in Japan, but normally you're at the White House. So I want to play a soundbite from President Trump, who was sounding rather optimistic. Let's listen to him, and I want to get your reaction on the backside. Let's listen.
Well, we're going to have a meeting with President Xi of China tomorrow, as you probably have heard. It seems to be a rumor about that. And we are indeed, and we look forward to it. I think it'll be productive. And who knows, but I think it'll be productive. At a minimum, it will be productive. We'll see what happens and what comes out of it.
Who knows? We'll see what happens. You've heard that a few times, haven't you, Nathan?
Yeah, and we will see what happens, but he's really not committing to anything. It's interesting. He's given sort of different takes on what this might happen, might happen. The U.S. president running hot, sometimes running cold, and essentially that's where his negotiators are. Remember, there is a division within the White House about whether a deal would be in the U.S. interest. We cover this all the time, and that it's starting to hit the U.S. economy, even though U.S. President Trump says tariffs are a good thing and it brings money into the Treasury and China pays tariffs. We know that's not true. It's U.S. companies and then U.S. consumers that pay it. And the real fear is, amongst U.S. companies, we saw the letter from 600 companies, including Walmart, is that if this next round of tariffs, this $300 billion comes on 25%, that doesn't just affect industrial inputs. Costs can be swallowed by some Chinese manufacturers, some importers, some consumers. This will affect everyday goods in everyday people's pockets. And even the New York Fed, Mike, has said already the trade war could cost the average American family over $800 a year, and it could get a lot worse.
Jim, that puts a lot more pressure on both sides to try and come up with a deal. You've sat at one of these tables. You've done these deals before. Many times, in fact. What's it take to get that consensus, do you think?
You know, Mike, first of all, I think the president has shown obviously a certain amount of affection for President Xi, but behind all that has been a concern that has been built up over a long period of time that he believes that the Chinese have been able to get away with quite a bit as a result of his predecessors not really manning the boat in the way they should have. And so I think the president is going to walk in the door in tomorrow's meeting with a fairly strong hand, at least in his own mind, given the fact that just today we had reported that the stock market in this first 6 months of 2019 have exceeded all expectations. Indeed, it's hit new records that haven't been met for 22 years. And so I think there is going to be a desire, certainly on the president's part, to be able to come up with some kind of an arrangement that allows for talks to continue. I wouldn't be a bit surprised if tariffs are, for the time being, put to the side. But I would be relatively optimistic that we're not going into a trade war as of tomorrow. So
you see a truce, but not necessarily a deal?
Correct.
Let me ask you about what you said about manning the boat, because I think it's an interesting point. You know, in the Bush years, it was the strategic economic dialogues. I think the Obama was strategic and economic dialogue. Here, it's just simply a trade war. All three of these administrations could have gone to the WTO with their grievances, which is a multilateral institution. They probably could have gotten allies on their side. Was that a missed opportunity?
I think it was, but you know, one of the things that we've got to realize is that the world today has never been more interconnected technologically or globally, as far as globalization is concerned, than we are right now. But we have never been more fractious, certainly in our lifetimes, politically and socially, as we are today. And we've seen an awful lot of governments arise from east to west that clearly are responding to the beat of a different drummer than we saw over the past 10 years. And so President Trump very much is trying to make up for lost time. And that's why this whole tariff business, which he imposed from his end first against the Chinese, has been so important to him.
Qinduo, let me ask you about concessions from either side. Do you see anything there? Any kind of promises from the U.S. side on bringing together this meeting?
Well, and I think for the Chinese side, we have from last rounds of negotiation, we know that China is ready to make concessions. For example, market access, the IPR protection, of course, and other concerns by the United States. I think there's no problem for China because that's in line in general with China's goal of further opening this country and more reforms. But of course, what China asks is really a balanced tax. For the last rounds of when they conclude the negotiations, not conclude, but the tax for the Chinese side, some of the wording, some of the words put, the way they put, is very hard for the Chinese government to accept. They want to a more balanced way of presentation, and also in terms of it's more than trade right now, right? We have basically more supply being cut off to the Chinese companies, not only to Huawei but also other Chinese technology companies. So the Chinese side is trying to figure out what is the final game of Washington, what is the bottom line of this bilateral relationship. That's why when the two presidents had a phone conversation, the press release from the Chinese side is President Xi Jinping is going to talk about fundamental issues between the two countries. That's beyond the trade and what kind of a relationship we are going to have between the two countries.
Qinduo, there's reports out today that the U.S. Department of Agriculture says that China purchased a large amount of soybeans ahead of this meeting before they get together, basically as a goodwill gesture. Is that going to do anything to help things, do you think?
I think so. I think obviously the U.S. farmers is the hardest hit group of people in this trade war, and I think for China, China sees it as a perfect match for the Chinese market to consume soybeans and other farm products from the United States, and even the cheap semiconductors from the United States, because Chinese companies need that. There's a natural organic supply chain cooperation between the two sides. There are Chinese products being sold to the U.S. market, U.S. markets and services being sold to the Chinese market. This is a natural growth between the two sides, between the two business communities. Unfortunately, it is being affected. Some of the supply chain is being cut intentionally. So business, not only the Chinese business side is being affected, but also the U.S. business community. So China is ready, and from the very beginning, China says, remember, it's not China who started this round of trade war. China wants to solve these problems, the trade deficit. China is cooperating with the U.S. side to purchase more products and services from the U.S. side, and of course, China has always been asking the U.S. to sell more, including like high-tech products to China, but the U.S. side is very sensitive to that. So we don't know how we are going to solve that problem within a short period of time.
Yeah, lots and lots of issues. Alexander, let me ask you about Chinese President Xi Jinping, of course, just traveling to St. Petersburg not too long ago as the guest of Vladimir Putin for that economic conference there. Do you see these two leaders getting closer and closer as the divisions continue between the U.S. and China and the U.S. and Russia?
Well, yes, there is obviously a bigger unity now, because China is obviously facing a completely new situation, I think, with America. And basically America and the West generally are pushing Russia and China together. So I don't really see at this particular summit any sort of serious cooperation between Russia and China, but that is a different matter altogether. And to be honest with you, I don't really think that G20 is a good format, because there are too many countries, too many questions to discuss, and what we're seeing now is that everybody is basically expecting how the Trump President Xi meeting will go on. Nobody is talking about anything else. And the Russian President Putin's meeting with Trump as well. So on the face of it, it's like the G20 summit, most of the other countries are on the sidelines of these sidelines, if you know what I mean. And maybe it would be better in the future if, for example, the G20 summit just, incorporates all the 20 countries, and then the big leaders meet, let's say, after the G summit, like a triple summit or something. Because would there be enough time for Trump and President Xi to hammer out anything? I don't think so. It's not enough. And everybody's saying, well, if there are no tariffs introduced, it's already a success. It's not a success. I mean, the situation is very volatile, and nobody knows what's going to happen, especially considering that Trump is an unpredictable person. And I think that this format itself is presenting a lot of sort of challenges for the leaders. And I think that the other countries are not really very happy about this all.
Nathan, to that point, this whole meeting sucking the oxygen out of the room, for a better metaphor, but also to his point about how unpredictable Trump is, there's also these teams within the White House. We've got Peter Navarro and John Bolton and Mike Pompeo, who want a really aggressive stance towards China. Then you have Steve Mnuchin, who says, hey, we're 90% there, we can get a deal done. Who's got the president's ear? And of course, Trump, really, that's the only team you really pay attention to. But again, as Alexander said, he's rather unpredictable.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. There was a joke here because the weather was bad towards the beginning of the summit, and there was a typhoon coming in, and the typhoon went away. But they said actually Typhoon Trump is still coming, and you know he does bring this sort of wrecking ball idea into any international summit. Now you're right. There have been divisions at the beginning from the White House. In fact, Trump likes it that way. He likes to have different arguments. But we've seen, especially since the lead up to the 11th round of talks in May, which hit a wall, that the China hawks, if you like, embodied by Peter Navarro, the author of that terrible book and film Death by China, have really got the upper hand. He kind of reflects Trump's thinking about a zero-sum game in international economics. Remember, Japan was a Trump was a hawk on Japan in the 1980s. Very similar today when it comes to China. Now, who gets the upper hand? Well, Trump, as you know, when it comes to other issues like Iran, DPRK, he can change his mind. And you can see from some of his words over the last couple of weeks that he knows that there is an economic impact coming, even if he doesn't necessarily say it. So the question is whether it is time to a deal. Now, as you know, in the US, everyone is running for office all the time, and we are entering the presidential re-election cycle. And there have been some Chinese scholars that I've spoken to and others in Beijing that say perhaps Beijing could just play this out until 2020. As we know, US President Donald Trump is not reassured of re-election. He is not. He's a very divisive president. So this is going to be weighing on the White House's mind as well. Despite the fact that US President Trump is author of a book called Art of the Deal, there haven't actually been that many deals that have passed. Remember, the US free trade agreement with Canada and Mexico still hasn't passed Congress. There was an amendment to the South Korea deal, but that was little. No, the Japan negotiations are going nowhere, at least until July. We could keep on talking about all these potential deals that he says he can do, but hasn't done them. A China deal would actually help. But the problem is, behind the rhetoric about trade are a lot of China hawks who want to force China to make reforms more quickly, more opening up, and also have a control of an enforcement mechanism which has huge sovereignty issues for China that, of course, Beijing and other countries would not be prepared to make.
Jim, to his point, and I've heard others, analysts say this as well, advising China, people from the United States advising China, don't enter into a deal because, and they point to NAFTA. They say Mexico enters this deal, and then the next thing you know, it's the only hammer in his toolbox. He wants you to swat at those tariffs. And that, again, Mexico is suddenly, they enter into this deal, and now we're going to impose more tariffs because of the border issue. That even when you enter a deal, he can still come back at you with more tariffs, that there's no real upside.
Well, there's no question about that. I think that's why, for example, soybeans were purchased the way they were by China just before this meeting. I'm amazed at how so many other countries are really beginning to penetrate or understand the political system of the United States. Those soybeans are coming from farmers in states which have an incredible influence on who the President of the United States is going to be, particularly going into re-election. And I think this was a reminder to President Trump that his wonderful base can in fact be there, and the Chinese were simply tipping their hat in that direction. At the same time, that can be taken away, in which if tariffs emerge from China's end, they could certainly be targeted towards the base of President Trump. So it's quite a game that everybody is playing at the same time.
I heard one analyst say it's Trump against the world because it's not just China. He tends to lash out at just about everywhere, everybody. He tweeted that India's retaliatory tariffs were unacceptable, said they must be withdrawn. This after the U.S. stripped India of its special trade status. But at the bilateral meeting, it seemed like they were chummy. What do you make of that?
Always. That is his modus operandi. President Trump going into this meeting, and I think that the G20 meeting is a forcing event every year that should and must happen. But before going in there, he was essentially attacking a number of countries and their practices. But he did what he has always done, and that is walks in the door, shakes their hand, throws his arms around them, and they're best friends. It's just his way of the art of the deal.
Alexander, back to you. There was also a meeting of interest, a trilateral meeting that took place, China, Russia, and India. Almost another messaging effort there, in a sense, that all these countries that are taking it on the chin could actually join forces. Again, should Trump be worried about any of that?
I don't think that Trump is worried about that, because it's just he's that sort of man. And I'm just going back to the Putin-Trump sit down, and I think that, you know, he is a charming man when the cameras are on, but I don't think that this same charm applies when he's left alone with his leaders. Maybe it's part of his method, you know, strategy or something. But from the Russian point of view, nobody expected much from that meeting between Putin and Trump, but it went well. And before, of course, Putin threw a cat between amongst the pigeons by giving that interview and saying that Western liberalism is basically dead, and that caused quite a racket everywhere. And everybody's now saying, well, did he mean just social liberalism, or did he mean economics? And I can tell you something. I have a slot on a very popular program in Russia, and I've been saying exactly that for many months, that liberalism in the West is finished. But I was adding that liberal economics are finished as well, and suggesting that China and Russia should think well before adopting any method. So I'm hoping that I've influenced President Putin a bit. Anyway, I think that, yes, there will be natural sort of unions, alliances struck between other countries when they feel threatened by America and the West generally. And I don't know, I don't think it's a bad thing, actually, because with America, maybe it's better that these countries unite and you know, act in unity. I actually think it's very important for countries outside, let's say, NATO, European Union, and West generally, to unite and be united on many issues. China and Russia are closing in, becoming closer friends, but I don't see much unity still between them on crucial issue, at least in public.
All right. Well, Qinduo, you brought up Huawei. Of course, you know, the president's had a lot to say about Huawei. President Xi had a little bit to say about Huawei as well. Let's listen to what he had to say.
We should build a fair, just and non-discriminatory market environment. We must enhance the exchanges of technologies, personnel and information, and maintain the integrity and vitality of the global industrial chains. We should promote a win-win cooperation. We cannot develop with our doors shut, nor should we artificially disturb the market.
So, Qinduo, do you think the President of the United States heard that message?
Hopefully, he will get the message. Remember, if you look at the cutoff of supply to Huawei, you know, the U.S. chip makers are being affected to a large extent, and now they are resuming the supply of some of the components and the chips to Huawei, because, you know, not only Huawei is affected, but they found themselves in a very bad situation. So there's a natural match between the two sides, but unfortunately, it is being cut off by Washington here. So I think for the Chinese side, you know, really is like the U.S. is demanding China, you know, for more openness, you know, more reforms, more market access, etc. But at the same time, U.S. seems to be closing its own market to the Chinese investment, to Chinese students, to Chinese companies. So, you know, you have to, if there's a deal, you have to make it more balanced. That is, like, both sides are opening or remain opening to each other. So for the benefits of both sides, because we know there's a win-win, you know, for both communities. Unfortunately, it is changing. So still, I think for the Chinese side, we still want to maintain a good relationship with the U.S. Because, you know, for the young Chinese students, they would say, you know, U.S. naturally would be their top choice for further studies. For people, they want to go to overseas, they want to travel to the U.S., want to learn more about the country. Investment, U.S. market is still very attractive. So I think there's a panic, there's anxiety in Washington, there's overreaction to the rise of China. And then you have a group of, let's say more hawkish people. They would say they focus more on the containment of China instead of making good use of the rise of China. For example, China is becoming the largest retail market. So for the U.S. business communities, this is a precious chance. There's more potential for them to sell their products and services to the Chinese market.
Yeah, Jim, he makes a lot of good points. And one of the other things that I hear is this laundry list of grievances against China, but not a lot of introspection from the U.S. lawmakers and administration. You know, you were talking about how these previous administrations didn't do their job, with the exception of former U.S. Trade Representative Charlene Barchefsky, who said this. She said recently that the U.S., if they want to tame the Chinese challenge, they need to get their own house in order. She pointed out that R&D spending in the U.S. is down as a percent of GDP since the 1950s. She pointed out infrastructure in the U.S. is, of course, we all know this, in decay, education lagging. If the U.S. wants to be competitive with China, she says it's going to have to up its game because China is talented and hungry. Do you agree?
I agree. I also think it's important to understand the motivation of President Trump. It is, if you literally go back to interviews that he gave 20 and 30 years ago, this is somebody who consistently talked about how upset he was that currency manipulation, robbing of intellectual property, a whole variety of grievances allowed the United States to be seen, in his words, to be a sucker in world trade. And for a long time, his target was Japan. But China has come on, obviously, so much strongly, particularly after it overcame Japan as the world's second largest economy. And so there's an awful lot of pent-up, I think, frustration, and in turn saying to himself, look, I'm the president of the United States now. I can take on a certain role that no one in my predecessors have taken, and it's time now to take the gloves off. And that's exactly what he's been doing.
Qinduo, to that point about the introspection, China is talented and hungry, and you talked about it. Is it competition or containment? And it seems a lot of people, when I talk to people in China, they feel as though the U.S. is trying to do containment and not be competitive.
Yes, that's the concern. I think the Chinese side wants to figure out, whether the U.S. is intended wholly on containing the rise of China, or the U.S. would describe the relationship as competitive. Competition is fun. If you look at the Chinese infrastructure, if you look at the investment, I know there are concerns, say about the IPR production in China. China is not doing not having a perfect track record. Let's say there's a transfer of technology, but look. If you look at the inventions, if you look at the patents of Huawei and the Chinese company, for example, in the blockchain, 1/3 of the patents were registered by the Chinese side of the global registration. And if you look at the AI, it's more than half of the patents were registered by the Chinese companies. 5G technology, Huawei itself is more than the whole U.S. companies combined in terms of it's like a 20% of the total. So it's hard work. It's not about stealing the technology.
You make some good points. We're out of time though. Thank you, gentlemen, very much. That is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Mike Walter in Washington, D.C. Thanks so much for being with us.